Welcome to From Betrayal to Breakthrough. I'm Dr. Debi Silber, and today's guest is Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Dr. Anthony is a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist specializing in psychodynamic treatment for individuals and couples. He's also a faculty member and supervisor, mentoring the next generation of mental health professionals. In addition to his clinical work, Dr. Mazzella is a sought-after keynote speaker at conferences and seminars nationwide. Driven by a passion for continuous learning, he shares valuable insights, strategies, and practical tips through his podcast and video channel, The Narcissism Decoder. So today we're diving deep into the world of toxic narcissistic relationships, and I have the right person to do it. Dr. Anthony is a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist with years of experience helping people break free from destructive relationship patterns. We're uncovering the truth about narcissism, how these relationships form, why they feel impossible to leave, and most importantly, what you can do if you're stuck in one. Whether you've experienced love bombing, devaluation, or trauma bonding, this conversation will shed lots of light on the psychological dynamics at play and give you the tools to reclaim your power. Let's get started. Okay, everybody, we are here with Dr. Anthony Mazzella, and we are talking all about toxic narcissistic relationships, and not just from anybody, because Dr. Anthony is a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, psychoanalytic, all these things. So I brought in the big guns to help us. Welcome, Dr. Anthony.
Hi, Dr. Debi. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So let's just talk about this. First of all, I can't imagine at this point anybody on our show anyway doesn't know what a narcissist is. Can you just share with us what is a narcissist? And then we're going to take it from there.
Yeah. So since we're talking about narcissistic relationships, maybe that's a really good place to start. What's meant by a narcissistic relationship? And in the literature, you typically hear there are cycles of idealization and devaluation. And all that means is there are moments of intense togetherness where you feel like you are being completely seen, acknowledged, appreciated, right? But then for some reason that changes. And then you suddenly feel like you're not being seen or recognized or acknowledged. And that's the devaluation. And that's where it can get quite ugly and be quite painful, actually. But what happened, and more recently, since there's so much literature now on social media about narcissism, what I'm discovering is many people recognize that maybe my partner, they begin to question it, is a narcissist. Lack of empathy, he devalues me, he doesn't seem very invested in the relationship, like all the common traits of narcissism. But despite recognizing that, for some reason, they can't leave the relationship. Like they feel compelled to stay in it. And even if they think about leaving the relationship, it becomes incredibly painful and they can't seem to pry themselves away from it.
And I really think you just nailed what so many of our listeners are dealing with. And before we even get to the trauma bonding or whatever we want to call that, let's talk about just that beginning stage where they're being so love bombed. And it feels so good, and they get either used to it or they like it, and then it stops. Now, is that intentional? Tell us what's going on with that dynamic. Is that just to sort of get us hooked? Like I picture somebody giving that little kid candy, and then all of a sudden it's like, nope, you're done with the candy. And they're like, wait a second, I like it. Yeah.
Oh, man. I mean, this is such a valuable question because, what you typically hear is, yes, this is intentional, but I work closely with many of these individuals. I've been doing this for 20 years in private practice, right? And what I've discovered is this is not intentional. They don't intentionally like love bomb or like hook somebody in and then devalue them. What happens is they truly believe, it's called, this is the more contemporary word for it, but it's called a shared fantasy. That's what people are calling it today. In my field, we've been referring to it as sort of a merger between an ideal or omnipotent self with a grandiose other. Like there's this beautiful merger between the two. So, in other words, they really believe in that moment, in that fantasy, that they found the perfect person, that you are the perfect person that's going to completely fulfill them. And then they're all in. And they're all in because something is inherently missing inside of them, which is very painful and difficult to acknowledge.
And I
Yeah.
just want to stop you there. Which
Hmm.
one is feeling, or both?
Oh,
This is it. This is perfect. Is
yeah.
it? Yeah. Who's
Yeah,
feeling?
and that's why, again, this is very controversial because in our society, it's much easier to blame the other person, like the narcissist who hooked me in, using some of the language just to
Mhm.
borrow from you, right? Or they love bomb me. But really close exploration reveals that this is a shared fantasy. So, in other words, the partner of the narcissist also has a feeling that something went missing in their life. And that's why the narcissistic charm, like if you think of more the grandiose type of narcissist, the center of attention, the beautiful woman, that's why it becomes so appealing because there's hope of all of what this relationship can fulfill that's already obviously missing inside of them. So yeah, they're a little more vulnerable to this type. That's why not everybody gets caught up in these relationships. So you have to think something else must be going on with the partner as well.
I love that you're
Yeah.
bringing this to light. Tell us about someone who's this the representation, the person who needs to be at the center, the person who needs to be the most beautiful, whatever it is. What what's going on earlier in life? Is there a way to sort of spot this?
Yeah, so typically what happens, again, there are many different theories about this, but the one that I subscribe to is early in life. And I think you could relate to this because Dr. Debbie and I had a conversation a little bit earlier on my podcast. But early in life they're in they have a need, let's say, and they turn to the caregiver. To use a common example, they come home from school very excited with their report card or project that they created, and the caregiver does what? They shush them. Now, in it in and of itself, that is not traumatic. But when this is sustained, or this is the major way of relating, and this is the way their needs typically go unmet, then yes, this is when it begins to create what we call trauma. That's the little t you and I mentioned, or you said death by 1,000 cuts. This is the little trauma or the trauma of everyday life, of not feeling recognized, not being seen, right? So, yeah, typically what we find in these patients is that they had a caregiver, the most important person in their life, who was either narcissistically preoccupied, maybe depressed, whatever it was, but they weren't there affectively, emotionally, in the way that this child needed them.
I can see so many. There are so many questions I want to ask you. One is I could just see people sitting down and saying, "Did your parent or caregiver shush you?" And then the answer is yes, they run. But you can also see the person who's, let's say, looking to date. Let's say they're starting to date, and they see this quality, this characteristic, and then they say, "Oh, I'll be the one to give them that attention."
Yes.
So tell us why that doesn't work.
Yeah, and yeah, that on the surface is a wonderful solution for that person because, again, as part of the shared fantasy, is the fantasy then for the partner is you could take care of the other person. In other words, the person cannot exist without you. Maybe because you've seen, like, beyond the grandiosity, there's always an immense level of vulnerability. There's actually even a category called the vulnerable narcissist,
Mhm.
but they go hand in hand. It's not like there's one or the other. It just depends on which one predominates. So that is immensely gratifying for someone to enter into a relationship with a feeling like I can save this person. I alone will be the one who rescues this person, right? That they can't survive without me. And that's part of what binds them now because they begin to gain their own self esteem from this fantasy that they are so important to this other person. And
And
that becomes addictive.
right. Tell us about the vulnerable narcissist.
So the vulnerable narcissist, I've been speaking about this quite a bit recently. It's it's the person who presents more like this. Instead of the grandiosity, it's more like They're very needy or clingy or demanding. They tend to pout or whine. So instead of being overtly grandiose, they are overtly vulnerable. And that, to some people, like we were just saying, could be quite appealing because then it evokes sort of a rescue fantasy that they could take care of them.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's so interesting. And a relative just popped into my mind the
Oh,
minute.
okay.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So what I'm fascinated with is
Mhm.
the partner's response to it. And I think so often it comes from this place of possibly they were wounded themselves and they're saying, here's an opportunity for me to just give so much love because I maybe it's from a place of I want to prove how loving I really am, how worthy and deserving I really am. And
Yes.
then it's met with uh, just not what they expect and not what they hope for. Why would someone be attracted to someone like this? Give us your menu. I have a few that I'm thinking, but I'd love to hear from
Mhm.
you. Why would somebody say, okay, this is definitely someone I'm attracted to?
So when you say attracted to, you're going from the partner now to the person who may be the narcissist. You're
Yes.
asking why may they be attracted to the narcissist?
Yeah.
Well, depending on again on the type of narcissism, right? So narcissists can be quite charming. They could be fun. They could be exciting. And again, if you are prone to this feeling of something missing inside of you, is very appealing. Maybe you were never the center of attention. Again, maybe let's say you're one of those vulnerable narcissists, right? Who has a lot of needs. And then you meet somebody who's very wealthy. And then there's the fantasy. It reminds me, I'll just digress just for a quick moment. It's like anybody who's ever been caught up in a scam, right? So the scam is external, right? These people are really good at offering things that are going to pull you in, wealth, fame, whatever it might be, right? A big payoff. But the scam actually takes place internally because not everybody gets scammed by these people. When you get these phone calls, some people hang up, some other people indulge in it, but it's because of the fantasy, right?
Right.
That they're going to feel so, complete by the end of the scam. They're going to be, like transformed, like this is going to be their transformation. In other words, yeah.
Right. So now let's go from the narcissist space.
Yes.
Do they when they're looking for a partner, what's going on in their minds? Who are they looking for? Someone who's vulnerable, someone who's empathetic? Like what are the characteristics they're looking for where they're like, oh, there's going to be a really good fit for me?
This is an important question. And again, there's some confusion in the contemporary literature, like social media.
Mhm.
People tend to think that it's the more vulnerable or what they're calling now empaths. I don't know if you've ever heard that,
Mhm.
but the narcissist typically goes for anybody who's available. So anybody who could give them what's called these supplies, which basically just means some sort of validation in whatever way they need it. So like the grandiose narcissist, needs the supplies for someone who could admire them, right? But you asked a moment ago about the vulnerable narcissist.
Mhm.
What kind of supplies do they need? Because all narcissists need supplies and validation, but they need literal taking care of, almost like a baby. So if they find somebody, right, who fits that and is available in that way, in their mind, that's a perfect fit. You see, there's the match, there's the merger, there's the codependency. They're all different names that people use for this.
Mhm.
But it's a merger between the ideal self, and then that grandiose other who's going to meet your need and give you those supplies.
Right. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. So, what happens when someone's in a relationship with a narcissist, whether it's the vulnerable narcissist, the more typical one that we hear about, where they realize, oh, wait a second, this this isn't, yeah, this isn't right. Something's off right here.
And you see, they will notice it because what happens inevitably, like, even if we just stay with the vulnerable for one more moment and they're very needy and you start to take care of them, right? Because remember, we said it feels good for you as well,
Mhm. Mhm.
but they never really appreciate it, right? So they never change because of it, because it's not actually what they need. Like, this is literally taking care of an adult at this point.
Mhm.
But what they really need is what went missing in early childhood, which is what? the deep emotional resonance, the recognition, all the things that they didn't get. They don't need to literally be taken care of because that actually undermines them, even though that's what they're asking for. And this is where it gets really complicated because you're like, you asked me to make your eggs in the morning or something. I'm just,
Right.
right? And then I get up early and I'm making you breakfast and you're still not happy. You still find something to complain about. So that's when they begin to recognize something is off here. And then the party's over because then it doesn't feel so fulfilling to them anymore.
Okay, so this I need you to just I need everybody watching, listening, you really that was such a brilliant point. It's so important to realize that it's not about doing more because I think the natural response is, well, let me try this, well, let me try that, well, let me do more. But
Yes.
what you're now seeing is that it's not about the doing because this is that person's lack and scarcity and unmet need that no eggs you could make would ever fill. Is that
Yes,
what
that's
I'm
right.
hearing?
Yeah, exactly. Like you would be much better served, right? If you're thinking, okay, if I don't meet them, like if I don't serve them, what do I do then when they have these demands and they're crying and they're getting louder and louder again, like an unfed baby. So
Mhm.
then if you can, and this takes a lot of emotional strength, not to get entangled in this, right? But to still be there for them at the same time. In other words, again, oftentimes what you hear, the best way to go forward with these kind of people is to create boundaries, like get your distance from them or get away from them. But not everybody can leave, and not everybody wants to leave because they do see something more in the relationship. You know, there are moments of genuine connectedness too. It's not like this is all or none. But to those people, what I say is then you talk to them about their wish for you to get up early and make breakfast. And if that really doesn't work for you, that turns into a discussion rather than an argument
Mhm.
or a hard no. And maybe even if you could do this, putting your heads together and thinking about first validating, like, I understand it's very important for you to have me get up and you're very busy these days or whatever it might be. So you first start by validating so they feel heard. But then it's kind of like, well, can we put our heads together and think about what would work for you in the morning? Because I'm not really in a position to get up early and make you breakfast or something like that. But the point is working together on the problem instead of just gratifying a need. Yeah.
And beautiful. And what happens then when, let's say, the narcissist is just blaming, not willing to take any responsibility for just their demands or whatever, and just blames it on, well, if you were only this or that or the other, or did more of some way. And then it's this exhaustive search
Yes.
in trying to do more. What do you
Yeah.
do when you're just met
That's,
with blame?
yeah, this is the trickiest part because now what you're dealing with from what you're describing is somebody who doesn't have the capacity to really reflect and to work together with you, right? So this is like you know how you have stages, right? In your so this is like a level 2 intervention. It's a little more sophisticated. And again, it's hard not to get entangled, but if you don't get entangled, you're in a much better position just to describe what's happening. And what I mean by that is, hey, do you notice that oftentimes you see me as so neglectful? That, oh, here it is again. I'm really neglectful because I won't wake up early. So, in other words, what we call this is an and a representation of the other person.
Mhm.
So, you're beginning to describe how they see you. Now, this doesn't mean this is the way you behave, although sometimes you may, and you really have to reflect on that, by the way, as well. Was I provocative? Do I neglect him in some way? Do I withdraw when I get angry? And if you conclude that you don't, then you're in a much better position to just begin to describe how they see you and then how they see themselves too. Because then they're like, what? They see themselves as the victim of you because you don't do these things for them.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you're describing what they're seeing, let's just say, and then they're just, yep, that's exactly it. You are this, and you're not giving me what I need. It's sort of like they're not willing to take that responsibility.
Yes.
What happens then? And I'm
Yes.
purposely taking you down this road because I know how many people watching and listening, that's exactly their scenario.
Yeah. So typically what I find, at least again, when I'm with these people and I'm with them quite a bit, right, is if if you're there in that mode that you just described, something already has not worked and you have to start over again because they're not yet feeling validated or appreciated. Something is still going on. See, because what you just described is they're still kind of in what we call a dysregulated state of mind, which means they're not in that, they don't have the capacity for a reflection. So we can't do anything, Dr. Debbie, in that moment except start over and be like, whoa, okay, hold on. I need to step back and breathe and then regroup and start over again because I must be missing something, right? And more likely than not, when you go back to more these validating comments and first appreciating their subjective experience without negating it, which most people don't do, by the way, they claim that they do it. They claim that they understand. But when I say you have to get close to their subjective experience, what I mean is you really need to understand how they're feeling at that moment and that they really do feel like you withdrew from them when you didn't return their call quickly enough. And that's what you need to go back to. And 9 out of 10 times, at least in my own experience, when you could do that without the anger or frustration, they feel heard and they begin to calm down. And that's when you can begin to talk to them.
But does that only work if you, like, let's say that wasn't even the case. Let's say you did return the call, but you just didn't, you didn't return the call fast enough. Do you
Yeah, well,
always have to agree with them in order just to calm them down? Is that
no,
the
no,
only?
no, no. So thank you. Thank you for saying that, okay? Because that's something I want to make very clear. You are not agreeing with their subjective reality. You are appreciating it. And they're very different. Appreciating it is more like, yeah, I can see how you saw it that way. I mean, that wasn't my experience of it, but I could appreciate that you saw it that way, right? But you're not agreeing with it. So no, I would thank you though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not agreeing, just appreciating.
I wanted to bring that up because I know so many people, they're like, this is not true, but the only way we move to the next thing is if I go along with everything they say. So
Yeah,
I'm
but you
glad you
can't.
cleared.
Yeah, you can't do that because then what are you doing? You're enabling it, first of all. And two, what's going to happen more, again, more likely than not, is you're going to end up feeling resentful. Maybe not in that moment, but over time, if you keep giving up your own sense of reality for somebody else, oftentimes what we call compliance, like that's kind of like a compliance, leads to resentment. So that would be a problem, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. So can narcissists change?
Okay, we have to define like what's meant by change, okay? So the short answer is most people out there, again, on social media, in terms of splitting, when they get very angry and they're like, my ex-husband is a covert narcissist and he will never change. So you hear a lot of anecdotal stories that people don't change. But when you start looking at the research, because there is empirical research out there that demonstrates that in certain ways, characterologically, yes, they do change. And in my own practice, anecdotally, I mean, I wouldn't be doing this with these patients, for so many years if it was just a hopeless situation. Absolutely. What we begin to see is that they do change. So someone like more of that grandiose narcissist who maybe comes in after having an affair, let's say, and having no regard for his wife or little regard, slowly over time, what we begin to see is that he's taking her into consideration. And if she says, "Oh, you're going out with your friends, where are you going to be?" And he's like, "Look, I'll just share my location, or you could call me, or I'll call you and I'll check in." And I'll say to him, "Why did you do that? Like, why are you willing to check in with your wife when you're out with your friends?" See, that's a little provocative, but I'm testing it, right, to see if this is genuine, right? Because he could say, "Because she's going to bust my chops when I get home."
Right.
See, then it's not as genuine. It's more like fear-based.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, what slowly you begin to hear when things go accordingly is because she was anxious, and I don't want her to be anxious. I
Mm.
mean, look what I put her through already, and I never want her to be in that position again. And if that means checking my location, or if I have to call the check-in, that doesn't cost me much. So that's a long answer to your question, but I really wanted to drive that home is that if there's enough motivation, that's a big part. And if they're interested, again, unlike your study that you mentioned earlier, remember you said there were certain groups who did not change, right? And I think one of your groups was people, I guess, who just didn't have the motivation or the interest or the drive or something
Yeah.
like that to
Mm-hmm.
change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the prognosis there is far more guarded than someone who comes in and they're more interested or motivated to do the work consistently over time. And that's the other piece I just want to mention is it's not a quick fix either, because
Mm-hmm.
this stuff is deeply embedded in their personality. So it does take time.
Yeah, that's I love that you're sharing that, and it gives hope to a lot of people. Do you find that they're more motivated to change if there's an abrupt sort of death and destruction of the old, or is it if they're given that opportunity, or if it's a new relationship? What do you find?
Oh, that's such a great question. Again, in my own experience, when there's an abrupt destruction, is far more valuable. And I think you would appreciate that,
Oh
right?
yeah.
That's a valuable opportunity. So when the wife finally had enough and says, get out, or when the guy, the grandiose narcissist, finally meets a woman who breaks it off with him and he's just devastated because he never gets broken up with, and she will not take him back again,
Mm,
that's when they typically come in, and that's a destruction because it's not just the loss of a relationship. Remember, this whole thing is about a fantasy that gets co-created, right? And the fantasy is there to avoid reality, to avoid painful feelings. So when there's a destructive act like that, now you're in reality because reality is tough, and there are disappointments and there are rejections. So that's when they typically are more motivated to change. Yes.
Dr. Anthony, I love that point. And you know, on your show, I talked about, and those who are listening, watching the podcast, you hear me talk about that house, right? When the house
Yeah.
is destroyed, the tornado comes by and levels the house. And that is such a beautiful moment
Yes.
to really reevaluate things and say, okay, everything crashed and burned. What do I want now? And it's as great of a motivator as it is for the betrayed. It
Yes.
can be a great motivator for whatever type of narcissist you see.
Yes.
Let's talk about the partner of that narcissist. What are there things that you see that they can do to move through this scenario where they need, I imagine they need to strengthen whatever was missing within them, which is always, I'm a big believer of that. But
Yes.
what do you see as steps they can take?
So my big belief is awareness is so important, right? So you have awareness by listening to people like you and me and listening to our podcast or watching our video channel. So that is so important is to have awareness of the partner that you're with, but also self-awareness, right? So this is the first biggest step in my own opinion, right? Is to have that awareness. And then if you recognize, like to your point just a moment ago, something is missing in me, and then I realize that when I lose my partner's attention, right, or when he's not praising me, or when we're not in that shared fantasy, that magical union, I feel lost or lonely or betrayed, right? Like that could be a betrayal, by the way. He went out with the kids and he didn't invite me. Like these are it doesn't have to be a big betrayal. I don't know if you have a big B, like a big T trauma, but these are like betrayals of everyday life when you're in a relationship. Then, if one can begin to know oneself, they could say, okay, so he left, he went out with the kids. Did he really, is he coming back? Is this my own sensitivity? And if this is my own sensitivity, what is this about? What does this have to do with? And does this mean that he's all bad now? Do I need to really lay into him when he comes back? By the way, this is what we call splitting in my field,
Mm-hmm.
where suddenly then somebody turns all bad. And this is the kind of stuff that leads to really, really intense fights and then the devaluation that we typically hear of in these narcissistic relationships. There's a separation that's intolerable. Sometimes they don't even recognize that this is the real issue,
Mm-hmm.
that because these are separations that are so small, right? But they break the fantasy. You see, they break the merged relationship. And then when the relationship, the merger breaks, then you're forced to face painful feelings. Because remember that relationship, the narcissistic relationship is like a patch. It's designed to not feel. It's like a drug, right?
Right.
So the short answer to your question is awareness is key, and then using that awareness to begin to question when there are these everyday separations, what does that trigger inside of me? And can I begin to process this without attacking or devaluing, my partner?
I think that's so important. Awareness, you can't change anything without the awareness. And I think, one of my favorite words is willingness. Are you even willing to look at how you're showing up and all of that? And I am never suggesting for 1 second that betrayal has anything to do with you. It really doesn't. But what I am suggesting is there's always a great opportunity to take a look and say, what's going on here? Is this working? Is it not the way I'm approaching this? Could I look at things differently? Could I not respond the way I am so that I can potentially change what isn't working? Dr.
Yes.
Anthony, what do you want to make sure everyone knows as we start to wrap up?
I think probably the most important thing is what you had already asked about a little bit earlier is there hope? Do these people change? I would just tweak that a little bit to say, can these relationships change? Since we're talking about like the umbrella topic is like narcissistic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke about, can a narcissist change? But narcissistic relationships also can change as one begins to recognize that when they're out of that fantasy, that union, that codependency, that they could survive that, with the proper support as well. I know this stuff isn't easy, especially like the example you used earlier, like when a tornado comes through and it blows down the whole house. So sometimes a little extra support is necessary. But the main takeaway is if you don't get too caught up, when there are those separations and what we call splitting, which means now he's all bad, or even I'm all bad, by the way, it goes that way too, because
Right.
his voice, which is so comforting when you're in that fantasy, you know, it turns very critical when you're outside of it. And then you have this critical voice, which is a whole nother story, which maybe we'll save for another day. But then people begin to feel very worthless or useless, or that they can't survive without their partner. But
Right.
just having a general awareness of all these things, yes, the takeaway messages, yes, awareness can lead to insight. And if you show up and you're willing to do the work, which could just mean, again, I know I said this before, but listening to people like you and me, experts in the field who do know what they're talking about and are not just blaming the other person, that's where then you could get some really good insights and information.
I think that's so powerful, and it's true. When we blame, we're handing over our power. So it's only when we're taking that responsibility we can do anything with it. Again, that doesn't mean we're blaming ourselves. It just means we're
That's
taking
right.
responsibility so we can do something with it.
Yeah, you
Dr.
have to be
Anthony,
very
where do we
careful
go?
not to blame. Yeah, not to, but
Yeah,
you got to be, then you're right back in that loop, except now instead of blaming him, it's just all against you and you're still not in reality because that's no more real than the fantasy of how wonderful he is and great he is.
right.
Yeah.
So helpful. Where do we go to learn more about you and the great work you do?
Everything's pretty much on my website. The video's there. I have a video channel. The podcast is there. It's just Dr. Mazzella, but with a DR, Mazzella.com. So it's just drmazzella.com.
Perfect. And we'll have everything in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom. I know you helped so many people with what
That
you
was
shared
my
today.
pleasure. Thank you again, Dr. Debbie, for giving me this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, what an eye opening conversation with Dr. Anthony. Stay in touch with him by going to drmazzella.com, and we'll have all of his information in the show notes at thepbtinstitute.com/podcast. Here's my biggest takeaway. If you've ever found yourself caught in a toxic cycle, this is the episode to watch or listen to because it was jam packed with insights to help you understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Remember, awareness is the first step towards change, and you can break free from patterns that no longer serve you. If this episode resonated with you, be sure to subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and take one small step today towards your healing and your transformation. Thanks for listening. Can't wait to be with you next time, and here's to your breakthrough.